The freedom to live your faith is a bedrock American principle, but has this right of religious freedom always enjoyed the level of protection it has today?
Let's look at particular challenges that have taken place in the past so that those who are thinking about the issues today are equipped to at least intellectually deal with them and also in some cases legally.
On this episode, we sit down with the executive producer of a new documentary, Free Exercise, America's Story of Religious Liberty. The film tells the story of how the fight for religious freedom influenced other rights that you and I enjoy. We discuss why this story matters and how it impacts debates over religious freedom today. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and this week we're talking about a new film about the topic of religious freedom. We've talked about this issue many times on Defending Ideas in previous episodes, but this episode is especially significant because there's a brand new documentary that's coming out. It's called Free Exercise, America's Story of Religious Liberty. And our guest this week is the executive producer of Free Exercise. His name is Thomas Lehrman. Thomas, welcome to the show.
Nick, thanks for having me. It's great to be on. I'm an admirer of the work of the Sutherland Institute and happy to be here.
Well, thank you for your time, and thanks for coming and having this conversation and for creating the film. We'll get into a lot of questions about how the film came about, why you think it's an important installment into the public discourse today about the free exercise of religion and what it means for us moving forward with all of the debates and arguments we're undoubtedly going to have about this issue. We've covered religious freedom a number of times on the show with our in-house scholar, Bill Duncan. It seems like there's always something going on in this issue area that makes these conversations really important. So I'm excited for you being here and to be able to talk about the film.
Well, delighted to be here and happy to go in whatever direction you'd like today.
So I do want to jump into a number of questions about the film, but probably for the benefit of our audience, let's go ahead and play the trailer for our folks out there and we'll watch it. And then let's kind of debrief after that and maybe dive into some of the details of the film. So we're going to play for you the trailer of Free Exercise, America's Story of Religious Liberty.
Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, Sikh. We, the people of the United States, can live out our faiths freely because of a guarantee enshrined in the First Amendment to the Constitution. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. But it wasn't always this way. Long before there was a United States, Quakers seeking freedom in New Amsterdam instead suffer the lash. But fellow colonists peaceably assemble and lodge the first written protest against persecution in America.
They were willing to stand up and say, it's our right to be able to accommodate their rights.
In Virginia, Baptist preachers are beaten, horsewhipped, and sent to jail. But a founding father follows his conscience, wielding his pen against the injustice.
James Madison says, no, toleration is insufficient. We need equal liberty.
In April 1789, George Washington comes here to St. Paul's Chapel to pray after his first inauguration just down the street. Months later, James Madison's words, free exercise, are carved into the Bill of Rights. But what do those words really mean?
In black churches, it meant freedom to worship, but also freedom from slavery, faith lighting the way along the Underground Railroad.
Faith and freedom. Slaves could not be fully a Christian in slavery.
Catholic immigrants hoping to exercise their beliefs and educate their children in religious schools instead meet venom and violence.
The arrival of the Irish immigrant really poured kerosene on the anti-Catholicism.
Sergeant,
By the end of the rioting, the church was really a burnt shell.
so both sides are shooting to kill.
Absolutely.
Mormons are chased from state to state, finally trekking west into Utah to live and worship in peace.
The governor said, drive out these obnoxious Mormons, and if they can't be driven out, exterminate them.
Jews in the Civil War South, wrongly tainted as smugglers, are expelled by General Grant from his department, but when the news reaches Washington, President Lincoln revokes the order.
There's intimidation about being publicly seen as a Jew.
America was founded on a revolutionary ideal.
We all are endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights. Those rights come before government, right? That people form governments in order to protect the rights.
The founders ordained and established a government of the people that would protect a fundamental blessing, religious liberty.
To me, freedom of religion is absolutely everything.
And I want to know that those exercises of religion are protected.
We take our freedoms for granted. What happens when those freedoms are diminished or taken away from us?
The U.S. stands apart from many places around the world, despite all of our challenges, still offering the most robust protections for religious freedom.
Religious liberty will not survive and thrive unless it lives in the hearts and minds of the American people.
This is the story of the greatest experiment in religious liberty the world has ever seen.
All right, Thomas, so that trailer, that just gives our audience a sneak peek of this movie that's coming out. And the first question I want to ask you is sort of to kind of channel if there's anyone out there who is a little bit skeptical or saying, oh, do we really need to be talking about religious freedom today? Aren't our rights fine and protected? And I'm thinking of someone out there who might say, well, I can go to church on Sundays. No one's kicking in my door saying I can't pray in my home. I can read my scriptural texts. If there's anyone out there who's kind of thinking, well, religious freedom is fine, it's protected, what's the big deal? Why do we need a film about it? How would you answer that question? What is the importance and the significance of this film today?
Well, the first thing I would say is, this is not a film that arises as simply a response to a threat that may exist today. We believe the history in and of itself is worth telling because of the stories that have happened in the past. And frankly, it's very difficult to predict when a new threat or a new issue related to religious liberty might arise. I mean, one of the important aspects of religious liberty in the United States and the text of the Constitution is its free exercise, which is more than simply praying in church. It's different ways in which free exercise may manifest in your work, in the schools that you participate in, through your children, or you directly. So there are lots of ways in which potential threats can arise for religious liberty, but there's no particular threat that we were focusing the film under or around. It was really much more, let's look at particular challenges that have taken place in the past so that those who are thinking about the issues today are equipped to at least intellectually deal with them and also in some cases legally.
I think it's notable that you chose the term free exercise for the title of the film. And as you're telling the story of religious liberty in America, free exercise is kind of what you settled on. And I want to ask you, why that? Why is that the term that seems, in your mind, to best capture this issue and tell this story? And maybe expand that to mean, what does it mean? What does religious freedom actually mean? Because obviously it's more than just you can believe what you want, you can pray, you can go to your worship services. It's bigger than that. Why is it bigger, and why is that title the way to convey that significance?
Well, I mean, you have the history itself of the term is interesting. And this history I first learned actually in sort of a fun and interesting way as a result of my own law school experience. I was a classmate of a gentleman by the name of John Noonan. And John's father, also John Noonan, Judge John Noonan, wrote a wonderful book called The Luster of Our Country. And it's a story about the experiment of American religious freedom. And some of his ideas inspired my thinking and our thinking as we were producing this film and developing this film. Specifically, the term comes from the Maryland Toleration Act of 1649 originally. At the time, it was really intended to provide for religious liberty for all Christians. Remember, the Catholics were coming over from Europe. There were Protestants in the United States. So the Maryland Toleration Act ensured that there was religious free exercise for both Protestants as well as Catholics. Now, it was James Madison who really took this idea and in the Constitutional Convention and the setting, really thought this was the right terminology to use to ensure that all faiths, in fact, had the right to free exercise. There's also this interesting question of, is free exercise the same as tolerance or toleration? That, of course, comes up in the context of George Washington's famous letter to the Jewish congregation in Newport, where he says it's not just about toleration. It's much more than that. It's about you having an equal liberty to exercise your faith in the United States. But with respect to the concrete aspects of why free exercise is so important, that in some ways really comes up in a very concrete way in the film with respect to education. Because it's not just persons going to church or worshiping in the comfort of their own home. It's the choice of either Catholics wanting to choose to send their kids to religious schools in the Pierce versus Society of Sisters case, or it also is dealt with in the Wisconsin v. Yoder case, which deals with Amish families who would like to, in fact, be able to homeschool their children. So these are some of the concrete examples of where free exercise doesn't just involve a private affair, but it involves how people are raising their families and the kinds of institutions that they can create, and frankly also connects to the concept of the right of peaceable assembly, which is also contained in the First Amendment.
Do you think that's one of the misconceptions about the very topic of religious freedom? And in conversations that I'm in, it's very frequent that I'm talking about this with someone, and they will again express that kind of like, well, you can worship, you can believe what you want, but there's almost this implicit, sometimes explicit message of worship and believe the way you want, but keep it to yourself. Like, don't bring it to the public square. Keep it in your home. Keep it in your churches or synagogues or religious institutions. But otherwise, kind of, there's this attitude of when you step out into the public square, you're supposed to check your religion at the door kind of thing. And that seems not only just wrong and limiting today, but completely antithetical to the history of religious freedom and the role of faith in society. Is that what you found in telling this story through this documentary?
Well, I think one of the more poignant moments in the documentary is when former Judge Michael McConnell, now a professor at Stanford Law School, says he's speaking about the Baptist story. And the Baptist story is really the story that, in fact, gives rise to the religious freedom guarantee in Virginia, and also, of course, inspires Madison with respect to the First Amendment of the federal Constitution. And what McConnell says is that a lot of this arose out of the Baptists, in fact, bringing their faith and their concern about religious freedom into the public square and seeking to influence the political process. And he says, were it not for the Baptists and were them not being active, we would not have a First Amendment. So the idea that religious freedom is just something you do in the private of your own home or in the quiet of a church is frankly contrary to the historical record that we see. And I think, again, Professor McConnell does a particularly good job of capturing that.
Well, the other thing, I think that the film sort of intertwines this narrative of exactly what you're saying, where various religious groups cared about something that was external to themselves. Maybe it's a group of people or maybe it's an issue, and very often dealt with sort of a broader application of civil rights, but it was their religious faith that motivated them to get engaged. And we've talked before on this show with Bill Duncan on our team about even the abolitionists during slavery in the United States, where it was very much a religious, there were Christians and religious folks who were saying, no, that this is wrong on sort of spiritual grounds. And I think that application is very true today. There are many good people and good organizations that are motivated by their faith to get involved in some societal issue today to fix something. And it does seem that bolsters the argument that no, free exercise of religion. Again, I love that you chose the term free exercise because it's about exercising. It's about physically engaging in work that blesses the lives of others. And we have to create an environment in society where that's okay, and there's an appropriate role for that in the public square. Is that maybe one of the key lessons from the film?
Well, you said of the abolitionist movement and, of course, the civil rights movement, it's really impossible to comprehend those movements and the outcomes of them without the vibrant role of faith in those. Just again, looking at the abolitionist movement, obviously many people are familiar with William Lloyd Garrison, the Liberator. which is a newspaper that galvanized many of the early abolitionists. But Frederick Douglass, who of course wrote an amazing narrative of his own experience as an enslaved person, and of course his escape to freedom. But he was inspired by his own religious convictions, and his religious convictions also led to his efforts towards the education of former slaves. So you also can see that in the Reverend John Rankin, who's mentioned in the film. And this is, of course, the scene that's captured vividly in Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, where Eliza the slave is escaping across the Ohio River. So what you realize is that religious freedom, not only does it motivate these great social movements, of course you see it with, as is mentioned several times, the Reverend Martin Luther King, who was in fact a minister in the civil rights movement, but you also see it intersecting with culture, through Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. So religious freedom is animating people who want to establish organs of the press. It's animating people who want to establish schools to educate those who may not have had the opportunities in the past. And it's also animating folks in the civil rights movement.
I want to ask you about the film itself, and there's more things I want to cover on kind of the substance of religious freedom and the free exercise of religious freedom. But the film itself, I mean, it's always interesting to sort of understand, how did things like this come to be? Anytime someone writes a book or creates a documentary or creates some big project with a goal in mind, obviously at some point it was just an idea in someone's head, and then now we have the film that's rolling out. Kind of tell us that story. How did this film come to be? What was the inspiration for it? Why did you and others feel like this needed to be made today?
Well, as is the case with many projects, especially one like this is a story with many authors and many contributors. In my own life, I have benefited from some wonderful friendships and associations that have formed my thinking on this. I mentioned an intellectual relationship with a friend, and also a book that influenced me a lot, the one by Judge Noonan, but also very influenced by the work of the Becket Fund, where I served on the board for 7 years, and the courageous leadership of Seamus Hassan, who really had the idea that what was needed in the United States was a public interest law firm that would defend the religious liberty of all faiths, not just those who were here first, not just Christians, not just Jews, not just Catholics who might have been here for over 100 years, but those of Muslims, those of Sikhs, those of Hindus, those who may have arrived in the great waves of immigration that have happened since the Immigration Act of 1965. So a real debt of gratitude to the entire team at the Becket Fund, and especially Seamus Hassan. Also, Rick Brookhiser, who was obviously my collaborator, among others in this. Rick is a great author of the American founding, also a great author with respect to Abraham Lincoln. We're here with the Sutherland Institute talking about a new birth of freedom, where I see it on your logo. And so Rick was a perfect partner to work with. We had worked on a previous documentary related to Chief Justice John Marshall and his role in really helping to define the role of the Supreme Court in the United States. And Rick was very interested in the history of American liberty. I was especially interested in, you could argue, it's the first freedom of American history, which is the right to free exercise, which many people forget is also captured in the preamble to the United States Constitution, where we talk about the blessings of liberty. And of course, it's captured in our founding document, which is the Declaration of Independence, that we all are endowed by our Creator with the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. My father was a scholar as well of Abraham Lincoln, and certainly his ideas and interests in the founding documents influenced me, and I think in many ways encouraged me to go down this path.
Thomas, one additional question on kind of how these things come to be. I mean, obviously, it wasn't just you. There's a team involved. There's a lot of work. I mean, we talk here at Sutherland often about whether it's a research paper or a podcast like this or anything where something unique and powerful is created. There's a team behind it, and I just want to ask you about how did this come about in terms of what did it take to actually get this film off the ground? Who were you able to rely on to create this project in a way that's going to be impactful?
Well, I would just mention, first of all, there are just too many people to thank in this short period. But what I would say is an extraordinary team came together. We were very fortunate, very blessed to have Leo Eaton as the original producer of the film. Leo and I and Rick Brookhiser had worked on a previous production, and Leo had just indefatigable energy for this idea. He was really excited about it. He really helped to shepherd along the script, which he helped to co-author along with Rick and with me. And then tragically, in fact, just after we had a session with the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty, we organized a conference, which is featured in the documentary. Leo passed on during COVID. And Leo's memory and his inspiration and also his energy really live on in this film. We were very blessed also to have John Paulson step in as the producer director after Leo. And John did a great job. The film took longer as a result. Barbara Ballo also helped very significantly with respect to editing, and just many other folks were also helpful. In fact, including my friend and law school classmate, Evan Young, who's featured as an interviewee in the film, who is now a member of the Texas Supreme Court. So many hands contributed to this, but I wanted to make a special mention of both Leo and John shepherding this film into creation, but also just remembering especially Leo, given that he passed on during the production of the film.
I want to ask you about the medium of storytelling that video can provide. We of course, Sutherland Institute, we're a public policy think tank. We have a number of people on our team who are great policy intellectuals who write deep, thoughtful pieces of content. Articles and research papers. We have some of them displayed in the studio room here, and we often talk about this question of when we're in this space. I would say, when you're in the business of ideas, which we are here at Sutherland, which you are with this new film, your goal is to try and create something that's going to inform, educate, or influence. That's going to put an idea in someone's head that's a good idea. One of our unofficial slogans at Sutherland is to make sound ideas broadly popular. So I'm very intrigued by the method of storytelling that a documentary, that a film can provide. It's different than a book. It's different than a podcast that we're talking on now. But I just want to ask you about, tell us about the power of video, of long-form storytelling in the form of this film that you think is hopefully going to have a big impact on Americans, the way they understand the exercise of religion, the way they view it, so that they're sort of prepared for, as you said at the beginning, the next time some threat comes up or the next time some conflict comes up. Can you talk about the unique storytelling potential of a film to convey these messages in a way that will resonate more deeply with Americans?
Well, I think it's a powerful insight. I was actually recently with a gentleman by the name of Rick Reckedahl, who was a senior gentleman senior team member at DreamWorks, and he talked about the power of storytelling and imagination, but also in culture. And I think that's exactly right. I think there's also a really interesting question when you embark upon a documentary about the topic of the free exercise of religion. There are lots of ways you could organize a film. You could go through a whole list of Supreme Court cases. You could spend a lot of time on sort of detailed legislative history. And as we reflected on, okay, well, what's the best way to tell this story? And there probably is no best way. We said one of the most interesting ways perhaps to tell the story is really through the lens of different religious communities, different groups that have faced particular challenges during the life of their community in the United States. And so I think that was with the idea that there was not only an interesting set of individual stories embedded there, but there was a sense of a community that was dealing with threats to their free exercise. And also at the same time, understanding how an America that's committed to the rule of law and public order is wrestling sometimes with what are the limits to free exercise. So anyway, we thought those 6 stories around 6 groups, which of course we begin with the Quakers, which gives people a sense for the question of free exercise predates America. It's really the colonial period that has some very interesting stories. We also mentioned the Maryland Toleration Act and Catholics arriving in Maryland. And then we move into the Baptist story, which is, of course, really in some ways the founding story. And that's so important. And then, of course, we move into the African American churches, the Black churches story. And that's so intimately connected to the desire also for freedom, desire for education. Which, of course, is another thing that manifests in the religious liberty question later. So it's through these six communities that we decided to tell the story, because there's both individual stories that pop up, but also the group is struggling with how do they become part of this American dream for religious liberty.
I want to ask you one more question before you go to a quick break. And when we come back from the break, there's some other things I want to cover kind of substantively about maybe key lessons from the film that's telling the story of the history of religious freedom in America, and then also how we can apply those lessons to today, sort of maybe bring it current for us. We'll do that all right after the break, but I want to ask you, before we go to the break, who is this film for? If someone out there is listening to this, they say, well, if I'm not a policy professional, if I'm not an academic or an intellectual, I mean, help sort of make the pitch of folks listening out there. Who do you hope sees this film, and what experience do you hope they have as a result of watching it?
Well, I think the most important audience, I mean, we talked a lot about this during the making of the film, because you're always the question of like, who is the audience? And of course, everybody would desire a very broad audience. But I think most importantly, we wanted to reach people who are in the process of being educated about these topics. People in high school, people in college, young people thinking about these issues maybe for the first time, and teachers who maybe have had access to textbooks or other things, but they haven't really had these stories taught in a rich way. So for us, that was really important. And then I think it was also important for us to reach the religious communities themselves. In this day and age, I think there's a certain either anxiety or doubt about the historical nature and the rootedness of religious liberty in our constitutional tradition, giving those who do embrace their faith in a serious and important way, helping them understand that this is very much part of the fabric of America, and they shouldn't have anxieties about whether this is in fact something that has a longstanding history and tradition in the United States.
We need to take a quick break, but when we come back, I want to ask you again about lessons learned from this film, maybe things that you learned throughout the process, but each of us as viewers of it, or hopefully potential viewers of it for everyone listening, watching this, what are key lessons that you think need to be drawn from the story, and then bring it current to what are maybe some of the threats to religious freedom today, and how can this deepened understanding of America's story of religious liberty, thanks to this film, help prepare each of us to go be better, stronger, more compelling, persuasive champions of the importance of this principle moving forward. So I want to get into all that right after the break. We're going to come right back. We're speaking with Thomas Lehrman, the executive producer of Free Exercise, America's Story of Religious Liberty. This is Defending Ideas. Stick around.
For a deeper dive into the issues you care about, read Sutherland Institute's official blog, Insights and Takeaways. You'll gain deep insights from policy experts and relevant takeaways voters need to know. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm Nic Dunn, and we're going to continue our conversation with Thomas Lehrman, who's the executive producer of Free Exercise, America's Story of Religious Liberty. But first, I want to remind you, if you like what you're hearing today, please visit defendingideas.org. You can find access to this and previous conversations, and you can also subscribe to the podcast on any of the major platforms like Apple, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you like to get your shows. Just search for Defending Ideas and click subscribe. And also, if you prefer to watch your content, you can find us on YouTube at the Sutherland Institute YouTube channel. And if you are watching us there, make sure you click the little bell icon in the corner so you get notified each time a new episode drops, which is every Tuesday morning. Again, that's defendingideas.org. You can also find short clips from these episodes that we encourage you to share with your friends and family or on your own social media platforms as you're engaging in discussions about the issues we're talking about. Again, defendingideas.org. Thomas, I want to continue our conversation and really dive into some of the lessons we ought to learn from the story that you tell in the documentary. what are some of the key takeaways that our audience is going to learn if they watch this film? And we encourage them to do so. It's a significant, I would say, addition to the public consciousness about the importance of the free exercise of religion. So what are maybe some of the key lessons you hope people learn that can shape our conversations here in the U.S. and maybe even global conversations about religious freedom?
Well, we've talked already about the importance of religious freedom, not just, again, in the context of worship or prayer or in a church, but also how it intersects with voluntary associations in America, especially those in education, those in healthcare. I would say one personal takeaway that I encountered actually dates back to the mid-2000s when I was working in the State Department. Secretary Condi Rice was in charge of the State Department at the time. She provided tremendous leadership on many topics, but religious liberty was an important one at the time. I was actually working in the international security field at the time. And one of the things that we were really focused on was this question of terrorism. And it was in our national strategy documents, it was not only referred to as obviously combating terrorism, but also how do we combat various forms of violent extremism around the world. And one of the reflections I had is that religious freedom and the religiously pluralistic society that we have in the United States is a really remarkable example to other countries around the world for potentially how you can bring those two pieces together. How you have both robust protections for religious liberty, but also how do you make sure that people are actually carrying out their religious freedom in a peaceful way? And that brings together two aspects of our First Amendment, both the right of free exercise, but also the right to peaceably assemble. So that's just one small reflection. We can go into that in more detail if that's of interest, but there's a kind of rich international history with respect to religious freedom that dates all the way back to the end of the Second World War.
And how do those things interact? I mean, I look at it as if you look at the kinds of debates we're having on religious freedom here in the U.S., and then you look at things that are happening in other countries throughout the world, and they're very different in that, in other countries, sometimes religious freedom rights are severely constricted, sometimes violently so. And so can you help us put into context, I mean, for folks out there who might be saying, well, what are we complaining about in the U.S. if you're going to the Supreme Court to have a religious freedom fight over, being able to use taxpayer dollars for religious schools or things like that? If people are seeing these things happening in other countries that are much more severe or violent or horrific at times, constriction of religious freedom rights, they're both important in a way. How do we help put that in proper context of what we're talking about here in the U.S. in the context of what's going on across the world?
Yeah, I think there's sort of maybe two ways to think about it. One maybe is just a comparison to another topic that some people might find of interest, which is the broken windows theory of crime, which was a very important theory that developed in New York. I used to live in New York City, so know the city's both challenges and successes quite well. But this is a theory that was put forward by a number of sociologists back in the 1980s. And the basic idea was that if you don't deal with the small things, namely the broken windows in either house or an apartment building, that becomes a place where crime takes hold and gangs take hold and more difficult situations will arise after that. You can think about it in a similar way with respect to religious freedom in the United States. If we don't protect religious freedom, if we don't protect the free exercise in the United States, we're much more likely to end up with a situation of a culture or a society that we might see in some other parts of the world where we have, in fact, people carrying out violent acts against others. And not respecting religious minorities, where they don't accept the idea of a pluralistic society with a number of diverse religions. So that's one way I'd think about it.
You've mentioned pluralism a couple of times, and we've had on the show previously Eboo Patel, who of course is incredibly articulate about this idea of pluralism, and I want to ask you about that concept of, well, what it means to live in a pluralistic society is that we each are able to, in fact, we are constitutionally protected to be able to sort of bring our whole selves to the public square. And of course, in this context, we're talking about it in terms of religious freedoms, and my faith can motivate me to do good for society. And there's many examples of that happening. But that pluralistic society in the context of freedom of association, I wonder if you can expand a little bit on the two categories you mentioned on education and healthcare, and how does sort of the societal support of religious freedom and free exercise of faith in more of a public-facing setting impact those two issue areas in your view, and how did you see that manifest in the film?
Well, one, just very briefly, I'd just also mention there's a kind of long tradition of recognizing the importance of voluntary associations in American history as being in some ways the thing that has distinguished America from many other countries around the world, including those in Europe. Alexis de Tocqueville, in his famous book, Democracy in America, talks about how that distinguishes Americans are constantly trying to figure out ways to solve societal problems through voluntary associations. And many of those voluntary associations are either religiously affiliated or religiously inspired. Again, you talked about education. You think about all the great schools in America. These could be schools of higher education, universities, or for that matter, new schools that are being started today that are religiously associated or religiously affiliated. Those could be Catholic schools, Protestant schools. They could be classical schools that have a religious dimension to them. They could be Jewish schools from all different backgrounds. So religious freedom very much is part of what I'd characterize as a tremendous movement going on in the United States to offer families, parents, and children a better educational opportunity. So that certainly is, I think, an important aspect of it. Then you talk about healthcare. Healthcare is fascinating because it not only implicates the religious liberty of patients, but it also implicates the religious liberty of caregivers, of nurses and doctors, and the freedom of conscience of associations who might be coming together to form hospitals or clinics, or for that matter, might be going on medical missions to foreign countries. So those are some of the interesting questions, I think. Again, how does religious liberty intersect with institutions, voluntary associations, both in healthcare and in education?
I want to ask too, I mean, as we kind of try and take this, I guess these lessons from the film and apply them to today. I mean, there's a ton of content in the film that tells these stories throughout history, and I think provides that foundation for each of us to be able to have a level of understanding of America's background and how we've arrived where we are today when it comes to protecting our rights of religious freedom, of free exercise. But I also think there's always that question of, okay, what does this mean today? What does this mean for me, for my community, for my country? And thinking of it in terms of the debates we're having today, there have been serious debates at the U.S. Supreme Court level over issues like this. And so I want to ask you maybe help bring everything current for us and moving forward, how should we be thinking about the kinds of public debates we're going to be having about religious freedom today, and maybe in the context of are there threats we need to be aware of? If we've watched this film and we say, okay, I believe in these principles, I'm ready to go defend the free exercise of religion, what threats do I need to be aware of? What kinds of public debates do I need to be prepared for?
Yeah, I think, well, one, I would say that religious liberty, I mean, there are definitely threats, but I would also say there have been really some important affirmations of the principle of religious liberty, especially as it relates to educational opportunity in the United States. You're probably familiar with the Supreme Court case Espinoza in Montana a number of years ago, where the Supreme Court held that if you were going to establish a school choice program that in fact allowed parents to send their children to different schools, that religious schools had to, the freedom of parents to be able to do that ought to be respected. So I would say, while there certainly may be threats, especially with respect to certain things that we talked about earlier, like the rights of conscience of doctors or healthcare workers, and also to a certain extent, there are some really interesting questions as it relates to the religious freedom of religious institutions, especially in the educational field, to hire teachers into those schools and to make sure that those teachers, in fact, are in conformity to the religious teachings of the religious community. There's some uncertainties about the way in which the Supreme Court might rule on a topic which is sometimes referred to as the ministerial exception. So what I don't want to do is paint a picture that the threats are either overwhelming or very significant, because there have been some very important affirmations of the principle. But I would say, both with respect to rights of conscience for healthcare professionals, as well as potentially some issues relating to to the ministerial exception in schools, and whether schools have the authority to, in fact, carry into fulfillment their religious mission. There's some uncertainty there. There's also some interesting questions around for-profit companies. And, there have been some cases that have dealt with companies that may, in fact, have a religious basis to their mission. To what extent does that allow them to have certain exemptions from other kinds of generally applicable federal or state laws?
Thomas, we're almost out of time, but I want to ask, for our audience out there who resonates with this, who think, I believe in the principle of religious freedom, and I support everything that these guys are talking about, but I'm not sure how to go and articulate that to my family member, my neighbor, my coworker, who's maybe very skeptical or even hostile, who maybe views faith in the modern era here in the United States in a very negative light. How can we prepare those folks to go and have these kinds of conversations? Essentially, can you give them some talking points to go and tell the story of America's religious liberty throughout history in a way that can support this principle and hopefully win over some converts, so to speak, to supporting this idea of religious freedom today? Help chart the course for us for those conversations.
Yeah, I think it's really about getting back to first principles. I mean, I think you have to start, again, you can start with the colonial history in America and understand how that influences the founding period. That's important. But especially important is understanding the founding documents and how they're connected. The Declaration of Independence, it establishes our inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Then in the preamble to the Constitution, and of all of us should be able to unite around the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. If there were documents that should serve as a unifying touchstone for us, those should be it. The blessings of liberty. In fact, when you use the terminology, a blessing is something that comes from your Creator, it comes from God. It's not just something that comes from government. And then, of course, you see in the First Amendment text itself, the free exercise. So these are things that are grounded in the Bill of Rights, they're grounded in the preamble of the Constitution, and grounded in our founding document, the Declaration of Independence. And then you look through constitutional history. You look at the 14th Amendment. You, of course, look at the civil rights movements. You look at the various legislation that grew out of movements that were connected to religious freedom. We talked about, of course, the abolitionist movement, the Civil War, the amendments that come out of the Civil War. So there's so many constitutional amendments. The one other thing I'd mention, especially since I'm here in Utah, is the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And this is a relatively recent act. This was 1993, if I recall correctly. And Senator Orrin Hatch and Senator Ted Kennedy reached across the aisle in a bipartisan fashion and said, religious freedom is not a partisan question. It's something all of us can get behind. And so that's not only did the two of them unite behind it, but President Clinton signed it with a ceremony on the lawn of the White House. And so religious freedom is not a partisan question, and we could see that all the way back into our founding history, but even very recent legislative history where you had very substantial majorities in Congress affirming that this right is really fundamental to what it means to be an American.
I think reminding folks that these principles are not and should not, and we should take care to prevent them from being hardcore partisan issues. That again, these are principles that should be broadly popular to all Americans. And I think that's the hope of these kinds of conversations, is equipping each of us to go and articulate these principles and tell these stories in that way with that goal in mind. In fact, here in Utah, we passed a state version of a Religious Freedom Restoration Act earlier in the 2024 legislative session. And it just, the power of this being a unifying force, I think, gets ignored often in our modern conversations. And I think that's a great principle to reinforce with folks.
Yeah, I mean, maybe the final thing I'd mention, and I think you perhaps alluded to it earlier, is you should think about religious freedom as really an important public good. It's not simply a private right that we're sort of granting. It's also something that enriches society, that the voluntary associations that are created by people who are inspired by their religious convictions, those actually enhance the quality of life and the pursuit of happiness of all Americans. And they're also a limit on the necessity to use government to, in fact, stem the ills that some of those voluntary associations are directed against.
Well, last question. If folks listening to this or watching this conversation are thinking, man, I got to see it, I got to go watch Free Exercise, where can they watch it? How can they get access to the film?
Well, we were delighted that PBS has accepted Free Exercise, America's Story of Religious Liberty, for showing on broadcast television over the course of this fall. Later this fall, we anticipate it also being available on the major streaming platforms, in particular Amazon and iTunes. But more details to come on that. But that's our anticipation of the release schedule.
Excellent. Well, Thomas, thank you for this time. I mean, it's a film that I think is a very important contribution to the public discourse on this issue, and I think will help to inform a lot of people, maybe even change some hearts and minds in a positive direction. So thank you for making it, and thank you for being here to talk with us about it on Defending Ideas.
Well, Nic, thank you for your leadership here at the Sutherland Institute and for working on this issue with me.
That is Thomas Lehrman, executive producer for Free Exercise, America's Story of Religious Liberty. We're going to take one final break before we leave you with a couple final talking points. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I want to thank Thomas for sharing his time to discuss Free Exercise, America's Story of Religious Liberty. It's an important film, and if you appreciate any of the civil liberties we enjoy in this country, I think it's worth your time. There are just a few key points from this conversation that I think you and I should remember whenever we're talking to someone who might be skeptical of religious freedom, or even if they're critical of the presence of faith in public life. First, as the film shows, many of the great struggles to expand full civil rights to all Americans throughout our history were driven in large part by people and organizations motivated by religious faith. So if you like the Bill of Rights, you should thank early Americans who fought for those rights, while also fighting for religious freedom. Second, there are many different faith traditions that have come together to make America the land of freedom and opportunity that it is today. It's important that you and I recognize and appreciate the positive contributions of this religious diversity. It's essential to having a healthy, pluralistic society. Lastly, our rights are never just inherently guaranteed. Each of us as citizens need to be aware of what it takes to preserve America's laws and culture of freedom, religious and otherwise, so that we can continue to protect these essential rights for ourselves and for our children. Well, that'll do it for this episode of Defending Ideas. If you enjoyed this discussion, please visit defendingideas.org, where you can access this and previous episodes and watch or listen on your favorite platform. Don't forget to subscribe to Defending Ideas on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you like to get your shows. And please share this episode on your own social media profiles or with a friend, family member, or coworker you think might find it interesting. Lastly, if you want to support the broad work of Sutherland Institute, if you want more conversations like this, please make a contribution at sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. Thanks for joining us on Defending Ideas from the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City. I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.